Christianity and positivity are not synonymous. Perhaps that seems obvious to you, and perhaps it doesn't, but in this episode, I want to dive into what exactly that means. Let's get started. So hello everybody, and welcome back to the Grace Nerd Podcast. My name is Eric. If you're new, make sure that if you enjoy content like this, that you leave a like over here on YouTube and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Or if you're listening through audio on your favorite podcast platform, make sure that you go ahead and follow. So let's go ahead and dive into what I mean by today's topic. Often in my content, you'll probably notice that there's often a phrase or a thought or a common Christian idea that goes around that on the surface of it seems pretty innocent, but for some reason it sort of rubs me the wrong way. And this episode's topic is no exception. There's a certain kind of thing that I often hear said in different media spaces or content spaces where Christians have decided to contribute, particularly spaces where the thing being produced is not definitionally Christian, but it's a place where Christians have decided to carve out a space for themselves. So for instance, in the video game streaming world, I have a small Christian gaming channel here on YouTube, and there have been times when I've collaborated with other Christian creators, and I've often heard them say similar things, often saying something like, welcome to the channel, make sure you subscribe. This is a place where you'll see positive content. I remember when Tim Tebow, I think, had a short stint on something like Good Morning America, and it was his job to present news stories where he was talking about positive things that were going on, basically to round out the show and to sort of balance out the negative news cycle. Basically, he was covering puff pieces. I don't think that lasted incredibly long. Or another example, there's a local radio station where I live where their tagline is positive and encouraging. I guess this in contrast to negative and discouraging, something like that. It's almost as if this is some sort of role that Christians have put themselves into. It's as if it's the primary definition of our worldview. Or worse, it seems like this is a space that was picked for us that we've embraced. Now, I should say right off the bat, positivity is massively important in the Christian worldview, and it's manifested most strongly in our eternal hope in the gospel. However, what bothers me is the relationship that it seems the world thinks positivity has to Christianity. It's not seen as a result of our overarching and objectively true worldview, but it almost seems like the small space Christians are meant to fill, serving a greater purpose in society over and above Christianity. It's as if our faith and worldview is only a means to an even greater end. I remember when I went to a youth group conference when I was a teenager, and we all stayed in a hotel and used one of their conference rooms. On one of the mornings, I ended up sitting down and having breakfast there, and ended up sitting with a couple that apparently were not believers. We got to talking, and they asked why we were in the hotel, and I ended up talking to them about the conference and what it was about, and of course it came up that it was centered around Christianity. They took this in a positive way, but they started asking questions that I think revealed a lot. They started basically asking, what ultimately does your faith do for you? And I was young and I stammered out a few answers, but this ultimately led to the woman asking me, so you're saying that your faith gives you self-confidence? And I was basically left saying something like, well, yeah, sort of, I guess so. I really didn't have a well-rounded answer ready. So again, notice the nature of this question and the presuppositions that are behind it. Christianity is not seen as an overarching, objectively true thing. It's seen as ultimately a tool that we can choose to use or not for a greater end, in this case, namely our confidence. So I've given a couple short answers, but ultimately we have to ask, what is Christianity? It's not a set of life hacks in order to make our life better that we can sort of sift through on the road to fulfilling our own agenda. Christianity is ultimately a God-given window into the nature of how the world truly is. It gives us a vision of history, the present, and the future. It tells us how God has truly acted in the world. Therefore, it is an interpreter of all of life, both positive, negative, glorious, or even horrendous. There's a saying that I've heard from a writer and pastor that I've grown to like very much, and it's the idea that Christians should assume the center in our culture. Ultimately, when we look at secular culture and movements that strongly disagree with Christianity, or political movements that we're ultimately opposed to, often you'll see a tone from these groups that they ultimately assume their legitimacy and their centrality in our culture. They assume the centrality of secularism. And I think ultimately what gives them this power is a perception of legitimacy. They perceive themselves as central, and I think the culture as a result perceives them as central. But again, I believe it is a Christian's job, even in this current state of affairs, to go ahead and assume the center, even if we haven't been given permission yet. Atheism isn't exactly in vogue these days, even though there are still plenty of popular atheists who give their commentary on culture. But I would actually say that these days, some form of spirituality is perfectly acceptable to have. But this vague sort of spirituality can in some ways be even worse than atheism. Because as open to some form of spirituality as unbelievers may often be, it is still viewed ultimately as a tool. It is still seen as some sort of product to serve a cause greater than itself. It ultimately serves the unbeliever. It is not something the unbeliever submits himself or herself to. Ultimately, God's self-revelation is not the central thing. Therefore, people who see spirituality this way will think in some sense that they're pleasing the spiritual powers that be, but in the meantime, they're actually becoming immune to the true gospel. As Christians, we're tasked with far more than simply managing the small box that culture wants to give us. We're tasked with far more than just marketing a small product that offers temporary positivity. We ultimately have a perspective that not only makes sense of positivity, but it gives us a view of the world that can interpret everything from positivity to the worst kind of negativity. It puts all of these things into a narrative that makes sense of all of existence. So let's bring this back to something as simple as Christian content creation on the internet. The content we produce should never be one-dimensional. For example, the fiction we produce will have often very dark elements. Our commentary on the world is going to reflect a certain measure of biblical complexity. Our advice and our exhortation and even our comforting words will not always come with a sparkling smile. If our worldview is a window into the true nature of the world, then what we contribute will be a contribution to all of the world. So there you go. There's my brief thoughts on this topic. I hope that you found it helpful. Before I go today, I want to mention something. For a long time now, I've been trying to find a way to find a place in the content creation world on the internet. This has taken the form of what you see here in the Grace Nerd podcast, but I've also had a gaming channel for a while that I've mentioned a few times in the past, and you'll find a link to that in the description. But however you've discovered my content, I'd like to share with you that at some point I would love to do something like this full time. And if you'd like to make that sort of dream of mine a reality, then I hope that you'll perhaps consider going over to my Subscribestar page. Over there, you'll see the option of contributing $5 a month. And eventually, I'd love to see enough subscribers over there to really perhaps even support me to the point where this could become something that I do full time. And that would mean the potential of different forms of content and more of it. So if that does perhaps interest you, then consider checking out the link to Subscribestar in the description. There's of course no pressure there, and if you'd like to support me in a more standard way, then go ahead and make sure you leave a like on this video if you're watching on YouTube, and again, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you know when new uploads happen. And again, if you're listening over on your favorite podcast platform, make sure that you follow over there. So again, my name is Eric, this is the Grace Nerd Podcast, and I hope to see you around in the next one. Thank you so much for watching or listening.